The most terrifying sound I ever heard wasn't a scream. It was the silence that came after it. My wife had just slammed the bedroom door so hard the picture frame fell off the wall. I stood alone in the living room, heart pounding out of rhythm, hands shaking with rage and exhaustion. And then nothing. A silence so thick it seemed to suck the air out of the room. I didn't know it yet, but that would be the last sound of my old life. We're always told that love heals everything. I discovered that sometimes love needs to die first before it can heal. My name is Daniel Carvalho. I'm a clinical psychologist with 15 years of practice. Ironic, I know. I spend 8 hours a day helping couples understand each other, teaching nonviolent communication techniques, mediating conflicts with empathy and patience. I had diplomas on my wall, published articles, patients who thanked me for saving their marriages, and every night I came home and repeated exactly the same mistakes they made. Maybe you're like that too. Maybe you also know how to give advice you can't follow. If this story resonates with you in any way, please subscribe to the channel. There are mysteries about life and death that science still can't explain, and I explore each one of them here. And comment below if you've ever felt like you knew someone from before, from a time you can't remember. I read every word. It was March of 2019. My wife Laura and I had been married for 12 years. The first 5 were intense, passionate, the kind that makes friends jealous. Then came the other 7. 7 years of a cold war that heated up every week. It wasn't physical violence, it was worse. It was the kind of violence that cuts from the inside. A sharp word here, a prolonged silence there, slammed doors, nights awake with our backs turned to each other in bed. The strange thing is that we loved each other. I'm sure of that. But there was something between us, an invisible barrier that turned any simple conversation into a battlefield. She said I was cold. I said she was dramatic. She accused me of never being present. I accused her of never being satisfied. And deep down, very deep down, we both knew it made no sense. Because in the few times we let our guard down, when she fell asleep on my shoulder watching a movie, or when I woke up and saw her, looking at me with those brown eyes full of sadness, I felt something I couldn't name. A longing, but longing for what? For someone who was right there beside me. I'm a man of science. I went to therapy, read Jung, studied neuropsychology. I tried to explain our dynamic with avoidant attachment, with family patterns, with childhood trauma. Nothing fit perfectly. It was as if there was a ghost in our relationship, something that wasn't in the room but controlled everything. That March night, after the silence of the slammed door, I grabbed my car keys. I needed to get out, I needed to breathe. Laura stayed locked in the bedroom. I didn't even knock on the door to say goodbye. Stupid pride. I went down to the garage, started the car, drove out with no destination. The streets were empty, it was almost 11 at night. I drove along the highway, the city lights blurred by tears I refused to let fall. My phone rang 3 times. It was her. I didn't answer. I'll never. Forgive myself for not answering. The truck came from the left. I was in the right lane, within the speed limit, seatbelt fastened. I make a point of saying this because it wasn't my carelessness. The driver fell asleep at the wheel. He invaded my lane on a curve. I saw the headlights. I tried to swerve. There wasn't time. The first thing I felt was pressure, a monstrous pressure on my chest, as if someone had placed a hydraulic press on my sternum. It wasn't immediate pain. It was pressure, my entire body being compressed. I heard metal tearing metal. I felt the steering wheel sinking into my chest, glass exploding, and then yes, the pain. A pain so absolute it had no location. It wasn't in my arm or leg. It was everywhere and nowhere at the same time. My head hit something. My vision turned red, not black, red, as if I was seeing through a curtain of blood. I tried to breathe. I couldn't. My lungs wouldn't obey. I tried to move my hand. Nothing. My body had become a prison. I was still conscious but only observing. Observing my own body shutting down, system by system, like lights going out in a building. There was a moment, I don't know how long after, when the pain stopped. It simply stopped. And that was more terrifying than the pain itself, because I knew what it meant. My brain, even in panic, was still the brain of a psychologist who studied neurology. The absence of pain wasn't good news. It was a sign of disconnection. Synapses coming undone, the body going into deep shock. I heard sirens in the distance, or I thought I heard them, I'm not sure. The world was becoming distant, muffled, as if I was sinking in water. I thought of Laura. I thought of the last words we exchanged. She had screamed that she was tired. I had screamed that I was too. What an idiotic marriage to end. What a waste. And then something happened that I didn't expect. Something that my scientific training, my 15 years of career, my diplomas and certificates hadn't prepared me to understand. I left. It wasn't gradual. It was instantaneous, like pressing a button and changing channels. 1 second I was trapped in that crushed body, suffocating, dying. The next second I was above it, floating, observing. The mental clarity was what shocked me most. I wasn't confused, I wasn't dizzy, on the contrary. It was as if I had spent my entire life seeing the world through a fogged window, and someone had finally cleaned it. Every detail was sharp. I saw my destroyed car below me. I saw my body trapped in the wreckage. I saw blood, so much blood. I saw the first onlookers stopping on the road. I saw the truck driver staggering in shock, screaming into his phone. And I thought with a calm that made no sense, so this is it. This is what happens when we die. We don't turn off, we wake up. I expected chaos, panic, fear. Instead, there was an overwhelming sense of rightness, as if I had finally returned to a place I'd forgotten existed. The paramedics arrived. I watched them cut through the metal. I watched them pull my body out. I watched one of them shake his head. I heard the words cardiac arrest. I heard the number of minutes without oxygen, and I felt absolutely nothing about it. Not because I didn't care, but because that body down there suddenly felt like a coat I'd been wearing, not the real me. Then the pull began. Not physical. There's no vocabulary for this in any language I know. It was like being a note in a song and suddenly hearing the rest of the melody calling you home. The accident scene began to fade, not darkening, not blurring, fading, as if reality itself was revealing that it had layers and I was moving between them. I didn't go up. I didn't go through a tunnel. Those descriptions always bothered me, and now I understand why. They're too linear, too three-dimensional. What happened was more like a shift in frequency. Imagine you're listening to a radio, and you've been stuck on one station your entire life. And suddenly someone turns the dial and you realize there were 1,000 other stations playing simultaneously. That's what it felt like. The new place, if I can call it that, had no geography, no landscape. It was more like being inside a thought, inside awareness itself. The closest comparison I can make is this. You know that feeling right before you fall asleep, when you're aware but not quite in your body anymore? That threshold state? I was fully in that state, but with complete lucidity. And I wasn't alone. There was a presence. Not standing beside me because there was no beside. Not speaking because there was no sound. But communication was happening. Faster than words. Purer than language. Thoughts transferring directly, concept to concept, with no loss of meaning in translation. The presence felt ancient and familiar at the same time. It wasn't God, at least not the bearded man on a throne I'd been taught about as a child. It was more like a field of consciousness that had always been there, that had always known me. And the strange thing is, I had the distinct sensation that this presence wasn't separate from me. It was an older, wiser part of myself, the part that had been watching my life from the beginning, the part that knew why everything happened. The first transmission came not as words, but as a question embedded in my awareness. Do you want to see? I didn't have to answer. My curiosity was answer enough. And then my life began to unfold, but not like a movie, not chronologically. It was more like every moment of my existence suddenly became accessible, like files in a database I could now open simultaneously. And the focus kept returning to one thing, Laura. I saw our wedding day. Not from my perspective, but from hers. I felt what she felt, the overwhelming hope, the terror beneath the white dress, the silent prayer she made as she walked down the aisle. Please let this one be different. Please let him stay. And I understood, with a clarity that cut through me, that she had always been afraid I would leave, from day one, before I ever gave her a reason. I saw the first fight we ever had, 3 months into our marriage, something trivial about dishes in the sink, but I felt her fear spike. I felt the ancient panic in her chest, a panic that had nothing to do with dishes. And I felt my own response, the walls going up in my mind, the cold rationality I used as a shield. I had felt attacked, She had felt abandoned, and neither of us understood why such a small thing triggered such massive reactions. Then the timeline shifted, and I was no longer in this life. I was somewhere else, someone else, but also still me. The feeling was unmistakable, like recognizing your own face in a photograph from childhood. Different features, same essence. I was standing in a courtyard, stone walls. The air smelled of coal smoke and horses. The clothes on my body felt rough, heavy wool. My hands were different, rougher, scarred. It was evening, late 1800s, maybe early 19. I knew this with the same certainty you know your own name. And there was a woman walking toward me across the courtyard. Dark hair pulled back severely, simple dress, eyes that I would have recognized across centuries. Laura, or the soul that became Laura, the same consciousness wearing a different face. In that moment I wasn't Daniel the psychologist. I was Thomas, a merchant, and she was Elizabeth, and we were married, and I was about to destroy everything. I felt the weight of the letter in my coat pocket, the letter I'd received that morning from another woman, a woman in London, a woman I'd been seeing during my business trips. The affair had been going on for 8 months. Elizabeth didn't know. Not yet. I watched myself, this other version of me, make a choice. I watched me decide to tell her, not out of honesty, out of cruelty, because she had questioned my spending, because she had dared to ask where I'd been, because my pride was wounded and I wanted to wound back. I told her. I felt the words leave my mouth, cold, calculated, designed to hurt. I told her about the affair, about the plans I'd made to leave, about how I never truly loved her the way I loved the other woman, and I felt, with the empathy that only exists outside a physical body, what those words did to her. It wasn't just pain, it was annihilation. Her entire reality collapsed. The woman she thought she'd married never existed. The life she thought she was building was a fiction, and worse than the betrayal itself was the coldness with which I delivered it. The absence of remorse, the cruelty in my eyes. I felt her heart break, not metaphorically. I felt the actual sensation in her chest, like something vital tearing, like a foundation crumbling. I felt the trust that held her world together dissolve. I felt her mind scrambling to make sense of it, to find solid ground, and finding nothing. She didn't cry. That's what destroyed her most. She was too shocked to cry. She just stood there, her face going pale, her hands starting to shake. And I, Thomas, that bastard version of me, walked away, walked out of the courtyard, out of her life. I left her there, shattered, and I never looked back. I moved to London, married the other woman, built a new life, and Elizabeth, my wife, my real wife, spent the rest of her years in that small town, broken, never trusting another man, dying alone. 30 years later, with my betrayal still poisoning her heart, and now here outside of time I felt it all, the full weight of what I'd done, the decades of pain I'd caused, the wound I'd carved into her soul that never healed, and I understood. I finally understood. The fear in Laura's eyes, the way she pushed me away before I could leave, the way she tested me constantly, looking for proof that I would betray her, the way she never fully trusted my love, no matter how many times I said the words. It wasn't paranoia. It wasn't insecurity. It was memory. Soul memory. The scar I'd left on her so deep it bled across lifetimes. And my coldness toward her, my emotional distance, my need to control, to keep walls up, that was guilt. Unresolved guilt I didn't even know I carried. The part of me that knew, on some level deeper than conscious thought, that I owed her something, that I'd hurt her in a way that required more than an apology. That required a lifetime of patience I didn't know how to give. We were not at war. We were locked in an ancient dance of guilt and fear, playing out the same pattern across centuries, trying desperately to heal a wound neither of us remembered making. The presence that had been with me through all of this transmitted another question, not in words but in pure meaning. Do you want to stay or return? And I realized I had a choice. It wasn't a voice from the clouds giving me an ultimatum. It was simpler and more profound than that. I could continue on, release the life I'd been living, move into whatever came next. Or I could go back to the broken body, back to the pain, back to the marriage that had been killing us both slowly. But now I knew. Now I understood, and that changed everything. I thought of Laura in that hospital waiting room. I knew without being told that she was there. I could almost feel her presence, the guilt eating her alive, the last words we'd exchanged playing on repeat in her mind. She would blame herself for my death. She would spend the rest of her life wondering if the fight had distracted me, if her anger had somehow caused the accident. She would carry that weight the same way she'd been carrying the weight of a betrayal she didn't consciously remember. And I realized that this was the point. This was why souls come back again and again. Not as punishment, as opportunity, the chance to repair what we broke, the chance to love the people we failed to love, the chance to heal the wounds we inflicted when we didn't know any better. I chose to return, and the moment I made that choice, everything shifted. The peaceful awareness began to contract, the clarity started to dim, and I felt myself being pulled backward, not gently, but with the force of a riptide dragging you under. I tried to resist for a moment, suddenly afraid, suddenly wanting to stay in that place of pure understanding. But it was too late. The decision had been made. The return was violent. That's the only word for it. Imagine being pure consciousness, weightless, free, and then being forced back into a meat suit that's been crushed and torn and is barely functioning. The pain hit me like a freight train. Every nerve ending that had gone silent roared back to life simultaneously. My chest was a furnace of agony. My legs were abstract concepts of pain I couldn't locate. My head felt like it had been split open. But worse than the physical pain was the heaviness, the overwhelming, suffocating heaviness of being back in a body. It felt like someone had dressed me in a suit made of lead and concrete. Every breath was work, every heartbeat was labor. After the freedom I'd just experienced, being trapped back in flesh and bone felt like a prison sentence. I tried to open my eyes, couldn't. Everything was dark and muffled and wrong. I could hear sounds, but they were distorted, underwater. Beeping, mechanical breathing, footsteps, voices, someone saying his vitals are stabilizing, someone else saying it's a miracle. I tried to move my hand, it twitched, that was all, just a twitch, but someone saw it. I heard the sharp intake of breath, I heard someone running. I heard the words, "He's waking up." The next few hours, or maybe days, I don't know, were a blur of tubes and lights and faces I didn't recognize. Doctors, nurses, tests, scans, medication pumping through my veins. I drifted in and out. Sometimes I was in that hospital room. Sometimes I was back in that courtyard watching myself destroy Elizabeth. The two realities kept overlapping, bleeding into each other, until I couldn't tell which life was the dream and which was real. But through it all, one thing remained constant. Laura, she was there. I couldn't see her clearly through my swollen eyes, but I knew she was there, sitting in the chair by the window, sometimes holding my hand, sometimes just sitting there in silence. I could feel her presence like a wound that had finally stopped bleeding. When I finally woke up fully, really woke up, it was late afternoon. Golden light was coming through the hospital blinds. My body still felt like it had been hit by a truck, which it had, but the pain was manageable now, controlled by medication and time. I turned my head slowly, and there she was, and Laura, sitting in that chair. She looked exhausted, dark circles under her eyes, hair pulled back in a messy ponytail. She was staring at her phone, but not really seeing it, just holding it like an anchor. And when she noticed I was awake, really awake and looking at her, her whole body went rigid, defensive, waiting for the man she'd been fighting with for 7 years, waiting for the coldness, waiting for the walls to go back up. But I didn't have walls anymore. They'd burned away in that place between life and death. I looked at her and I saw both women, Laura and Elizabeth, the same soul, the same beautiful, wounded, terrified soul that I'd hurt so badly once that the injury had echoed across time itself, and I felt something break open in my chest. Not pain, release, like a dam finally giving way. I tried to speak. My throat was raw from the breathing tube. The words came out as a whisper. "I'm sorry." That's all I could manage. "I'm sorry." She stood up, came closer to the bed, her face a mixture of confusion and fear. Sorry for what? For the fight? For not answering my calls? "Daniel, the accident wasn't your fault. The truck driver fell asleep. You didn't do anything wrong." But I shook my head slowly. That wasn't what I meant. I needed her to understand. I needed her to know that I finally knew. It took me several tries to get the words out. My voice kept breaking. But I managed. "I'm sorry for what I did to you. Before. A long time ago. I'm sorry for leaving you. I'm sorry for breaking your trust. I'm sorry for making you afraid to love me in this life because of what I did in another one." She went very still, her eyes filled with tears. She opened her mouth to speak, but nothing came out, and I realized she didn't need to understand it intellectually. Some part of her already knew, the same part that had been afraid I would betray her since the day we met, the same part that pushed me away to protect herself from pain she couldn't explain. She knew. I reached for her hand with the arm that wasn't in a cast. She took it. Her fingers were cold, and I pulled her closer, ignoring the pain in my ribs, ignoring the protests from my broken body. "I need you to know something. I'm not leaving, not this time, not ever. I came back for this, for us, to finally get it right." She broke then. The tears came. She leaned down carefully, resting her forehead against mine. We stayed like that for a long time, not speaking, just breathing together. Two souls who'd been circling each other across centuries, finally finding their way back to center. The months that followed weren't easy. I had 3 surgeries, physical therapy, trauma counseling, and our marriage still required work, real work, the kind that doesn't get fixed by one mystical experience. But everything was different now. The invisible barrier between us was gone. The ghost in our relationship had been named and could finally rest. When she got scared and pushed me away, I understood why, and I stayed. When I got cold and tried to build walls, she understood why, and she reached through them. We weren't at war anymore. We were 2 people who'd hurt each other in another lifetime and were given the extraordinary gift of a second chance to heal it, and we weren't wasting it. I tell you this story not because I expect you to believe every word. I'm a psychologist. I know how this sounds delusional. The brain creating fantasies during trauma. Oxygen deprivation causing hallucinations. I've heard all the explanations. Maybe they're right. Maybe my mind invented everything to cope with. Nearly dying. But I don't think so. Because the information I brought back changed everything. The fear in Laura's eyes that I could never explain. The guilt in my heart that had no logical source. The pattern we'd been trapped in that made no sense in this lifetime. It all made sense now. And we're free. If you're fighting with someone you love, if there's a war in your home that you can't explain, consider this. Maybe your enemy is just an old love you haven't finished healing. Maybe the person who triggers you most is the person your soul has unfinished business with. Maybe forgiveness isn't just for this lifetime. Maybe it echoes backward and forward through time, healing wounds we didn't even know we carried. The love we're capable of is bigger than death, bigger than time, and sometimes it takes dying to remember how to truly live.